Hello and welcome to this Class 5 in Maya 312, and this is the part of the course where we're going to be looking at our product beauty lighting. And in our case, our product is this RC car, which is sat here on a rock in the foreground of our scene. Now, you can imagine that we've gone out and we've filmed a TV commercial for this RC car, and then right at the end we want a really nice pack shot of this car lit beautifully to try and sell the product. So we've got some exciting stuff coming up in the next couple of classes. We're going to be lighting this so it looks really great. We're going to be utilizing lat long HDRs. We're going to be utilizing HDRs in area lights as well. But we're also going to be including a graphic in here which shows the sale price of the car in Nuke after we've rendered it out. We're also going to be including shadows casting onto the rock and environmental lighting and that kind of thing as well. Everything that you would expect from a full CG render. So for this class, I want to just go in and get familiar with the scene, and then also prepare some of the things that we're going to need for our lights as well. So let's go to the perspective view, and let's take a look at what we've got here. So we've got a 3D model of the car here in the foreground, and this is a really nice asset. It's full of nice little pieces and components, and it's got some really good shaders and textures, and no doubt we'll take a look at those when we start rendering it out later on. Also inside of this scene, we have got the rock that the car is sitting on. Now this rock's quite interesting, and it really plays into the philosophy behind this course. When you capture things from the real world and put them into your CG, it's really easy to get a nice realistic result a little bit more quickly. And this rock was actually captured using a photo scan, and then it was retopologized right here inside of Maya 2020, utilizing the new retopologize tools that Maya has available. Now, if you haven't started using the retopologize tools inside of Maya yet, I'd highly recommend it. It's so useful for doing things like photo scans. Now, unfortunately, photo scans goes a little bit outside of the remit of this course, but it's just interesting to know how this rock was created. And it's going to play in really, really nicely when we start casting shadows, because when we cast the shadows onto the rock, it'll follow the contours and it'll just look that little bit more realistic. It's also helped us out with the camera track as well. This rock tracks really nicely into the scene because, of course, it's based on a realistic reality capture, which has helped get the track to work a little bit better. All right. Also in the shot, we can see that we've got our plate in the background, and it's pretty simple. It's just a tilt down, and it's going to focus in on our car nicely towards the end. Now also, slightly unusually, we've got a softbox model in here. Now if you're unfamiliar with what softboxes are, they're a type of photographic light. It's basically a black hood, and then on the front you've got a diffuse material, and inside you've got a bright light. So we're going to try and emulate that here. We're going to put an area light into the front of our softbox, and we're going to use that to light the scene. Now I love working with these little rigs because it really helps you to constrain your lights to something that's more based in the real world. It stops you doing anything that's really unrealistic, like having very, very large lights where you wouldn't expect them, having very small lights where you wouldn't want them to be. And also the positioning and the angle of the light can play into really helping give you that just extra 1 or 2% realistic result. And it's something that I encourage people to work with when I'm working with them on my team. You know, take your area light, put it into a softbox, and position it something that's realistic, because it's really going to help us get a nice result. In this little rig, we can angle the hood of the softbox. We can use the slider section to move this up and down as well. And of course, we can reposition the whole thing. All right, so we're probably going to end up with a couple of these in our scene, one over here on the right hand side, one on the left hand side, with a couple of different light maps in those area lights, maybe a warmer one, maybe a slightly cooler one. But we're also going to couple this with a lat long HDR of the environment as well, and color match that HDR to our plate to give the most realistic result possible. And that's going to do all of our environmental lighting, and it's really going to sell the effect of this being a realistic CG car for our pack shot. Okay, so I think the first thing that we want to do is go straight ahead and start creating some softbox elements to go into our lights here. So in an earlier class in this course, we started looking at raw therapy. Now, if you're unfamiliar with raw therapy or you missed that class, it might be worth going back just to take a look at some of the things that we were doing in there. But for now, we're just going to touch on the highlights of the software. And it's broken down into three main components: the file browser, the queue, and the editor. And this is something that we touched on in that previous class. So again, if you missed that, it might be worth going back to check that out, just to help you out in this part of the course. Alright, so the first thing that we want to do is use the file browser to navigate down to the image bracket that we're going to be using to create our lights. And that's actually in our Maya folder, underneath source images, HDR, LED softbox, and then underneath raw, you're going to come in and find these four images. Now, previously in the course, we used a 5-image bracket to create lights, but this light, we only really require 4 images. That's absolutely fine. Depending on how bright the light is or how complex it is, you may end up with more or less images. In this case, we've got 4, and that's going to work just fine for us. The objective here is to neutralize these a little bit, adjust the color temperature, and export them as TIFFs so we can compile them down into a HDR image for our lights. So I'm going to apply all of our edits to this one here, and I'm going to double click that to open it up in our editor. Okay, great. So the first thing that we'll notice is if you cast your mind back to when we just started this class, I was talking about having 2 lights in the scene, and I think it'd be wise to have one of them a little bit warmer and one of them to be a little bit cooler, and that'll give us a nice complementary range of lighting in our scene. And the first thing we want to do is take some of the warmth out of this light. So underneath processing profiles, let's just make sure this is set to neutral. And now nothing will have changed inside of raw therapy for us in this case, because neutral is the last save profile that we used, but it's always just a good idea to set this to neutral unless you're using some of the presets that you've saved. I'm not going to adjust very much in here. I'm not going to adjust the exposure or anything like that. I'm going to jump over to the color tab, and this is where we're going to set our temperature. So from method, I'm going to switch from camera to custom, and I'm going to bring our temperature down. I'm going to bring this down to something like 3000. Okay, so this is a good base for us to work from. Now scrolling down a little bit further, let's just set up a couple of things in the color management here. So camera standard is fine for the input profile, but then for the working profile, let's switch this to wide gamut. Okay, and then in the output profile, RT version 4 sRGB is going to be absolutely fine for us, but we do want to turn off black point compression. Alright, so now all I want to do is jump back to the file browser, right click on our hero image here, processing profile operations, and hit copy. Select the other 3, right click, processing profile operations, and paste. Okay, and this is going to copy those adjustments over to the other lights. Alright. So I'm going to select all of these. Once again, right click and hit put to queue. Head over to the queue tab, and they're down here already. The file format we want is 16-bit TIFF, not the 16-bit float, but 16-bit TIFF is going to work really well. We can leave that uncompressed, that's absolutely fine. Okay, and then if we click on the save to folder, we can see that we're already inside of our Maya directory, and we just want to go to source images HDR and then into LED softbox. There's 3 folders in here. Raw is the source folder, and then TIFF is the folder that we want to output these to. So let's hit open, and then all you have to do is click on the little Q switch at the top, and that will process the images for us. Okay, so they've gone down with no errors, and that's absolutely fine. So let's close down raw therapy and switch over to Luminance HDR. Now again, we covered Luminance HDR in a previous class, and if you want a few more details, it might be worth going back and checking out that class because we covered a few things there. But for now, all we want to do is create a new HDR image. Let's hit the plus arrow to add these in, and yeah, we're back here at our old class. So let's go and find the TIFF images that we just exported. Okay, so navigating over to that TIFF folder, I want to select all of these and hit open. You're going to get a warning for the EXIF data straight away, but don't worry about that. Let's just hit open. Okay, so as a default, these are set to 2 EVs apart. Now we touched on this in a previous class, but EV means exposure value, And in layman's terms, all this is meaning is that these images were exposed for longer and therefore they're brighter when they've got a positive number, and for less time and are darker when they've got a negative number. Now the Sony camera that I like to use for this type of work has a nice preset for 3 EV brackets. So we're actually working with 3 EV increments instead of 2. Okay, so all we need to do is come in and just adjust those. So coming down here and selecting 3 instead of 2, and then instead of -2, we want to have -3. And then we want to have -6 up here on the top. Okay, so -6. So now we've got a nice bracket of images going from 0 to +3, and then -3 and -6. And this is going to give us a really nice range once this is compiled down into our HDR. So let's just go ahead and hit next. And the profile that we're looking for is profile number 5, the linear profile. We can leave show HDR preview on for now. Let's hit compute. Okay, so this is looking really good. We're not clipping anything here. So let's hit close. Let's turn off show HDR preview and hit finish. Okay, so we don't need to do anything further here. Let's go over to save as. And we want to go up a level. Find that EXR empty folder that we've got. And instead of having this really long file name, let's call this LED soft box _ v001, and then we want to save this as an EXR file, so .exr. All right, and underneath the drop down here we can change this to OpenEXR, and let's hit save. Let's close down Luminance HDR and open Nuke. Okay, so here inside of Nuke, let's just do a little bit of housekeeping first. We're set to 25 FPS, which is absolutely fine. Then underneath color we need OCIO and then the ACES config. And then we're also going to set our viewer to Rec 709 ACES, because that's what we're working in for this course. So let's tap R on the keyboard, go and find that softbox and hit open. All right, so here's our softbox. Now it's looking a little bit dark. If we just sample some of the colors here in the middle, this is now 1.14, and we want this to be a bit brighter just right off the bat to save us a little bit of legwork inside of Maya. So let's deselect that sample. Hit tab on the keyboard, and I'm going to put an exposure node in. And then with this set to densities and gang, I'm going to just hit 1, and that'll apply that to the red, green and blue channel. And it obviously brightens our light up quite a lot. So if we sample the colors in the center, we can see that this is now reaching sort of the 40s, 50s, which is going to work a little bit better for us. So to sample this light, let's drop down a curve tool and just check out the values that we've got here. Underneath curve tool, let's change the curve type to max luma pixel, and let's hit go. 1 to 1 is okay for a range, and hit OK. And underneath the max luma data tab, we can see that our maximum luma data is 76.7, which is absolutely fine. That's a really nice range for us. And then our minimum is all above 0. The thing to watch out for in here is very, very high values in the maximum luma pixel. Sometimes you can get some strange artifacts which could produce extremely high values and cause you some issues later on when you're rendering. So just watch out for that. And then in the minimum luma pixel value, these all have to be above 0. You don't want any negative values in here. Okay, so let's go ahead and delete that. Now, a little bit earlier on, I mentioned that we might end up having a couple of lights in our scene. Maybe one is a bit warmer than the other. And I think as a default, this is probably fine for the cool light, but I'd like to make a warm version as well. So to do that, let's drop down a grade node. And underneath gain, let's click on the color wheel and just slide this down so we get a slightly warmer image. Not too far, just a little bit. Okay. So now when we sample the colors, hit 1 on the exposure and hit 2 on the grade node. When we flick back and forth, we can see that on the cool light, the red value is about 40, the blue value is about 26, and on the warm light, red value is about 54, and the cool value is about 16. Okay, so let's deselect that range. The next thing that we need to do is squarify this, and by that I mean we need to turn it into a square. And that's because inside of Maya, the area lights by default are square, and we can manipulate their shape in Maya. we don't necessarily want to put in a non-square image into an area light because it conflicts with that default. We might end up with a slightly weird shaped light. So we need to drop down a reformat node. I'm going to do that right up here at the top. So reformat. Resize type needs to go to distort. And then the output format, we can work with a square 1K. If you want a little bit more resolution, you can of course choose 2K, but for the purposes of this course, I think probably 1K is enough data for us. Let's drop down a right node underneath the exposure and then reconnect the gray to the exposure node. And this is going to be our cool light. Okay, so in the right node, let's click on the File tab. And I went ahead and wrote these out before the class, but let's do it again. So let's select the cool light, and the naming convention for that is LED softbox underscore cool underscore v001.exr. Let's hit save. Scene linear is fine for a color space, but let's write ACES compliant EXR. Okay, so that's going to write out our cool light. Let's hit copy and paste and connect that to the grade node here. And again, I wrote these out before the class, but just so we can see them, we're going to switch this one to warm instead of cool. Okay, so LED softbox underscore warm underscore v001. So we have a warm light here and a cool light here. All that we have to do is go to render all right nodes. A range of 1 to 1 is absolutely fine. So let's hit OK. All right, now all we have to do is load those into Maya. And to do that, let's head up to the Hypershade. Hit tab on the keyboard. Let's create a file texture. And this is going to be our warm light. So let's call this warm underscore texture for texture. Let's click on the file. Okay. And then inside of our source images folder, let's go to HDR, LED softbox, EXR, and let's find that warm light right here. Let's hit open. Okay. So let's create another file node, file texture. All right. Again, click on the file, and this is going to be our cool texture. So let's hit open there, and we'll rename this to cool underscore text for texture. All right. So these are ready when we're ready to plug these into our lights. So these are ready to go. I think it's only fair that we plug these into some area lights. So let's minimize the hypershade. And we're going to create an area light that fits nicely inside of our softbox here. So let's go to the Arnold menu, lights, and let's create an area light. All right. So it's just inside the rock at the moment. So let's move that up and we'll put this over here inside of our softbox. And it might be a good idea to do this from the front view. So let's zoom in. Just looking at it from the back now, but that's okay. If we go to the wireframe, we'll place it right about here. We can start to expand this out. And this is a good example of why you should really squarify your light maps before you bring them into Maya. Just because inside of Maya, we're going to want to change the shape of our light. So let's just turn off the image plane so we can see this a little bit better. Okay, so this is going to stretch it out to something similar to the aspect ratio that it was when we shot it. Let's go to the top view, grab that area light, let's zoom in, come and try and find that. So that's fine if we just place it here. We don't really want it inside because it might start causing some artifacts around the edges of the softbox. Let's just place it slightly outside. It's going to give us exactly the same effect. Okay, let's go back to the shaded view, and that's where our light is going to sit. So this can be our warm light. So let's call this warm light. We can put this underneath the softbox geo. Now we can manipulate our light as we like. So I think to begin with, we're going to start with the light probably somewhere over here. We're going to get into the lighting of this shot in the next class, but we just need to set these up to begin with. Let's select our warm light, go to the hypershade, and that's here in our hypershade. All we have to do is connect our warm texture to the color of this light, just like that. And we're ready to go for the next class. We'll start dialing in the exposure and things like that, positioning the lights, but for now this is looking pretty good. So let's rename this light stand group to light stand warm underscore group. Okay. And with this selected, let's go to edit and then duplicate special options. Let's reset these to make sure that we don't make any mistakes. And we definitely want to copy, but what we want to do is duplicate the input connections, not the input graph. So let's hit duplicate special. Let's take this light and we're just going to move it over. Just like this. All right, so that's looking pretty good. And all we need to do is rename this to light stand cool group. All right. And then underneath here, let's rename that light to cool light. And then up in the hypershade, we can see that we've got our warm connected to both our cool and our warm. Let's just grab our cool texture and plug the out color into the color of this light. All right, so now we've got our warm texture going into our warm light and our cool texture going into our cool light. Excellent, so let's close that out. The next resource that I want to gather for this class is the environmental HDR. So that's the lat long HDR that goes into the background. Let's jump back over to Nuke and take a look at that. Okay, so we've still got our softboxes in here, but let's tap R on the keyboard. And we want to come out of that directory and find the Strong Sun Late Morning EXR. Now that's included in the Maya folder underneath Source Images HDR. And that's here, Strong Sun Late Morning. Let's hit open. Let's hit 1 on the keyboard to view that, and let's zoom in. We can go to full screen. Okay, so a couple of things that we just want to talk about before we go any further. We've got a resolution of 4K on this light, so that's 1496 by 2048, which is probably plenty for a shot like this. If you had something that was extremely reflective, you might want to have a higher resolution, so you get just a little bit more detail. But for something like this, 4K is going to be absolutely fine. Things about this HDR that we just want to be aware of. We've got a color chart down here on the floor. Now that's going to be playing a big part in the next class when we start calibrating things. There's also me standing here with the tripod. The tripod is placed on top of the rock, so when this is wrapped around, the rock is below us, and the car is going to sit on top of that rock. So we've got plenty of range in this HDR. If we bring the gain down, we can see that the sun over here poking through is obviously very, very bright. But let's just go ahead and make sure that we don't have any crazy values in here before we begin. Okay, so again, to do that, we're going to use the curve tool. Drop that down. Curve type is max luma pixel. Let's hit go and hit OK. Come over to the max luma data tab. And this is really, really encouraging because straight away, the max luma pixel is over here on the sun. Now, let's say, for example, that we had the brightest pixel over here on these windows. Well, that would be a reflection of the sun in the window. We might want to do something like paint that out. But in our case, it's right over here on the sun, and that's absolutely fine. But we do have some negative values in this HDR, and that's okay. They're down here around these artifacts. That happens sometimes. It's not going to be too much of a problem. All we need to do is drop down a clamp node. So between the curve tool and our HDR, let's drop down clamp. All right. In max luma pixel data, our highest value is up here somewhere around 200. So let's put into our clamp maximum 200. All right. And then our minimum is set to 0. So when we come down to our curve tool again, over to curve tool, hit go, hit OK, go over to max luma data, we can see that our top end hasn't changed, but we've just got rid of all of those negative values. So that's going to help us prevent there being any kind of artifacts in here. So before we go through the process of color matching this to our plate in the next class, I'm just going to write this out as a new version to make it a little bit easier for us. So I'm going to hit W on the keyboard to create a write node. Go up to File, I'm going to click on the original file name, change this to version 2, hit Save, ACE is compliant EXR and Scene Linear is absolutely fine, hit Render and hit OK. Now let's read that back in, version 2, hit Open, and to make sure that it's working nicely, we can connect our Max Luma Pixel curve tool over to this read node, go to Curve Tool, hit go, hit OK, find that max luma data, and we can see that the color values are exactly the same as they were before. So this is a great start. Let's go ahead and include this in our Maya scene, but we are actually going to replace this image map with a color calibrated version of it in the next class. But let's go and drop it in just so we've got a placeholder. So let's go to the Arnold menu, Lights, and Skydome Light. And this is what's going to hold our HDR. Now we're going to load in that HDR map into this light just as a placeholder, and we're going to swap it out with the color calibrated version later on. But I just wanted to do this to set an initial orientation and have things set up for the next class. So let's come over to the Skydome light, and underneath color, let's hit the little chip and come over to File. Click on the file. Let's go up one level, another level, and we're looking for that version 2. So let's hit open. And we're ready to go to set the orientation on that and adjust the exposure and all those kinds of things in the next class when we swap it out for a color calibrated version.